Login accepted.
On our link. Okay. This is where we are right now, enforcing order with Active Directory. This Friday, we have a meeting from 4 to 6 on building a Windows fortress. Yay. Become a paid member if you haven't yet. If you are a paid member and you didn't get your shirts yet, they're by Natalie and me in the front if you want to come get it. Search and deploy or SanD is happening this Saturday. So if you haven't signed up yet, make sure you do so by Thursday because we want to get all the teams finalized. If you did sign up for SanD, then just make sure you're part of that competition server, but I think we'll send out the link again. But yeah, make sure to sign up for SanD. If you're coming in person, it will be in 1001, so like the bigger room on Saturday. Signups for NCL are still open. We're gonna close them this Friday. We still have a couple spots left for like free vouchers, so make sure to get those before other people do. And then Swift Pals, we finally finished getting like all the groups together for Pals. So if you interviewed for Pals, you should have gotten a link to join the Pal server from your mentor. But if you didn't, then just reach out to Matthew and we'll figure something out. But yay, our Pals are here. Okay.
Thank you, Sydney. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Raymond. I'm a Swintern, and I'm also a fourth-year CIS student.
Hello, I'm Jerry, and I'm a Swintern lead, also part of CPTC and fourth-year CS student. And some of the things we'll be going over are Active Directory and the domain services within Active Directory. Then we'll be transitioning to some of the authentication protocols used in Active Directory domain services and some of the attack vectors as well, and how to remediate against those attack vectors too.
All right, so let's get started by taking a walk in the forest. All right, so what is Active Directory? Well, essentially, it's a database of objects within sort of contained networks, in a contained network. So an object in an Active Directory database consists of users, groups, printers, and computers, basically anything within the domain. Active Directory needs to be ran on a domain controller. For example, it would usually be ran on Windows Server 2016, but I think Linux also has their own with FreeIPA, which is like their version of Active Directory. But it allows users to access services within the domain. It's mainly used in like business settings or schools, hospitals, because it centralizes it makes user management more convenient. Because let's say, because you guys could log into like the school computers with your CPP credentials, right? That is in part because of Active Directory. So if Active Directory didn't exist, you would have to create a local user for every computer in the campus, which is obviously really unintuitive, counterintuitive, basically. And so the structure of Active Directory, it's so within one domain, it's a collection of users, groups, computers, as well as organizational units. It must contain at least one domain controller. And an important service within Active Directory is domain name server. It allows, basically it resolves an IP address to a names.
Yeah.
Like our namespace, for example, calpolyswift.org. So if you were to join, or if you were to add a workstation to a Active Directory domain, it would contain a DNS name, or it would have a DNS name, essentially. So a forest is essentially a collection of domains, and it's usually like the think of it as like a country, right? And then a domain could be like a city or a state, essentially. And it's used as basically a security boundary across the entire domain and across multiple domains or all the domains in the forest. And it's also used as like the main global catalog for resource lookup. So within the forest, there could be trees, right? So it's essentially a group of domains linked together. They are they usually have like the same name. So for instance, like domain.com, it could be like the root domain, right? And then the subdomain could be like a child domain. So a tree could essentially represent like the entire forest, or like there could be multiple trees on a forest. And there's also sites, which are physical network locations. So within a domain, you could have different resources be at different physical locations. So let's say if you wanted to access a resource remotely, you could do that. And schema is essentially how your Active Directory is sort of your Active Directory domain is sort of like structured. So for this example, this is a singular domain, and within it there could be a user and some workstations or computers, and it can also host other resources such as file shares and printers. And an organizational unit is essentially a way to basically organize what's
users' computers.
like users compute like so you could organize these users sort of like as a way to enforce like certain policies. So let's say, for instance, this organizational unit could be, I guess, like that's HR department or sales department, whereas maybe the one organizational unit could be a like IT unit. So people who are in IT would be in this sort of like organizational unit. And so a tree, so it lays out, so on the top of the tree is the root domain, and it has multiple subdomains, and usually the
Sorry. No, you're good. So sort of adding to what he was saying, the calpolyswift.org is considered like the root domain or the parent domain. And then we also have like subdomains like eboard.calpoly.swift.org or calpolyswift.org. And they can be accessible to public users, or sometimes they're only accessible to internal users. And just to the right of it is another subdomain with members.calpolyswift.org. also another child domain, but the right side tree or the right side forest can also be an entirely different domain. It doesn't have to be related to calpolyswift.org. It can be its own entity, but it still belongs to the forest. And continuing on with trusts, so we have that kind of triangle triforce that we saw earlier. Well, essentially there's like links between them, and that's what's called the trust. There's directions of trust. So we have the ant.lakers.com and dav.lakers.com. Since at.lakers.com, the direction of trust is to the right, the direction of access is to the left, meaning the dav.lakers.com can access resources from the left-sided forest, but the right-sided forest, or I'm sorry, the right-sided forest can access resources from the left-sided forest, but the left-sided forest cannot access services or resources from the right-sided forest. So that's that's actually, yeah, unidirectional trust is what it's called. And there's also a bidirectional trust. So the other one, it's only like a one-way trust or unidirectional. This one's bidirectional. So the direction of trust is in both directions. So the direction of access is also in both directions. So cool.lakers.com, users within that forest can access resources from the right-sided forest known as nice.lakers.com, and vice versa. Nice.lakers.com users can access resources and services from the left-sided forest. So, and then kind of continuing further on with bidirectional, or I'm sorry, trust. Do you want to take over this?
So usually, when you create multiple domains within a forest, there's usually like a bidirectional trust, and it's so by default, when you create multiple domains, they are usually transitive, meaning so let's say you see here, domain A is linked to domain B, and domain B is linked to domain C. By default, there would be an implied trust between domain A and domain C because it's transitive bidirectional trust. But you could configure your trusts in a way where A and C do not get that trust, which would be considered non-transitive. So domain A and C do not have that trust. However, domain A and domain B has the bidirectional trust, as well as having a bidirectional trust with domain C. Oh yeah, sorry. No, you're good.
So with the trust as well, the bidirectional transitive trust, domain A can access services and resources from domain C. So they don't have to go through domain B. They can just jump straight to domain C and access whatever's hosted on there. With the bidirectional non-transitive trust, domain A cannot access domain C. To set up a non-transitive trust, you have to manually do this, but with bidirectional trust or bidirectional transitive, by default, the trust between forests are bidirectional as well as transitive. So you would have to manually set up a non-transitive trust.
All right, so within an Active Directory service, there's a program called Group Policy, which allows you to essentially create organizational units, as well as create I'm sorry, Group Policy Management allows you to enforce policies on created organizational units, as well as other objects. I believe by default, the containers you cannot enforce like custom policies on the default containers, such as users or computers. So you would need to create your own organizational unit and move the users in that organizational unit in order to enforce policies. So other than implementing or enforcing policies on objects, you can also do other things such as configure administrative settings for specific workstations or users within or objects, as well as deploy certain applications with group policy.
So with organizational units, you can sort of think of them as like containers. And within these containers, they'll specifically have like either computers within them, or another OU will have only users within them. The group policy, you'll create a rule. Let's say you want the computers to shut down at a certain time. Then you'll apply that rule to the specific OU or the container, and that'll only apply to that container that you apply that rule to. There's also something called inheritance. So you can have containers within containers, and whatever container is inside the OU or the top level OU, the group policy will apply to that child container as well, or the child OU. And you can also block inheritance. Let's say you don't want that inner organizational unit to take that group policy rule. You can just block it and the rule won't apply to that child OU. So LDAP is a pretty important protocol within Active Directory. It can also be considered like the language of Active Directory. And it's a way for you to query and modify services and search for users. This will also give you like the permissions the user has, the group it belongs to, what domain it belongs to, especially when you're dealing with a forest. There's many domains, so it's important to know like what belongs where. The downside is this validates credentials, user credentials, using unencrypted methods. So an adversary can intercept the queries being sent to the Active Directory. Another method is called LDAPs, which is an extension of LDAP, and it uses SSL and TLS. These are like encryption methods encryption methods, and TLS is more preferred than SSL. Ideally, the infrastructure should be using LDAPs, but in order to convert from LDAP to LDAPs is pretty difficult. You have to go one by one for each application or service that is in the domain and change that manually. You also run the risk of breaking stuff as well. So kind of have to factor a few things in before actually doing that. Just below it is like the syntax. So CN is like the certified name. So we have T Lopez. OU is the organizational unit that it belongs to, which is user, and then the domain controller Swift Lakes, and local being the root level domain. So you can kind of see it as like a hierarchy. You start at local, go down to Swift Lakes, then you go into the OU user, and then within that OU is T Lopez. So yeah. And then now we'll be talking about some of the important authentication methods used or found in Active Directory. So we have NT LAN Manager or NTLM. This begins with a authentication request. Usually the client will send their username. The service that you are trying to access will send a challenge, which is like a random number. And the the client will send a response with the hash password within that response to the service that they're trying to access. The service will then either accept or deny the request, or whether or not the client can access that service. And this is also like another huge part of Active Directory. It's called Kerberos. It deals in the form of tickets. So if you're trying to access a service, imagine you're trying to ride a train, you need a ticket to ride the train. Same thing with services. If you want to use that service, you need the ticket, which can also be considered like a digital pass. This confirms the identity and permissions for that user, and it also enables single sign-on. So within a domain, you're going to have multiple services, and it can kind of be cumbersome. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it can kind of get annoying if you want to access more than one service. So re-entering your password multiple times can just kind of be a bit redundant. So single sign-on is enabled as well. So you just authenticate once, and then you can access multiple services within the domain. This is possible by what's known as the KDC, also known as the Key Distribution Center. This is what actually issues the encrypted tickets and enables secure communication. There's two types of tickets, the ticket granting ticket or TGT and service ticket, also known as TGS. And there's also service accounts. What distributes these tickets is the KRB TGT, which is found in the KDC. Bear with me. I know it's a little confusing, but we have a diagram that kind of goes through this step by step. Service accounts typically act on behalf of the user, and it's also known as delegation. We have unconstrained and constrained delegation. So unconstrained is the service account can act on behalf of the user and access any service in the domain, and constrained delegation limits the service account to just one service. So unconstrained, if you ever see that, you might want to question it because it's pretty insecure unless there's a really good reason for that to be on the domain. So yeah, Kerberos kind of works in with keys, and there's the KRB TGT service account user I mentioned. And yeah, so we have our client, Anthony Davis, and he's going to authenticate to the key distribution center because he wants to access the service. So we request that ticket I mentioned earlier called the TGT, and he inputs his password, and that's encrypted with a key. And oh, I'm sorry, from the password, we get a key, which is encrypted with the timestamp, which is then sent to the key distribution center. From there, we get that TGT, and go to the next one. And then we request the service ticket, which is called the TGS. And if the KDC verifies that, hey, this is a legit TGT, they'll grant us that TGS. So there's that resource service or server that we're trying to access. It can be like an email server or a web server, whatever you have on the domain. So once you have that TGS, the ticket granting service, ticket granting service ticket, then you'll send that over to the email server, and the server will then respond with a resource access. So now you can go ahead and use that email server. And then, so while it's important to know how to, what Active Directory is, it's good to watch out for what type of attacks are within Active Directory. So usually adversaries will perform what's called like the enumeration phase or the information gathering phase. They'll try to identify like potential targets and vulnerabilities. The point or what they do within this phase is not to actually attack the Active Directory, but just to see what exists within it, what potential vulnerabilities are present. And some popular tools are Bloodhound, which is what that picture is. It'll show you like exactly what users belong to what group, how to go from like a low privileged user to a higher privileged user as well, like administrator. And SMB map, another good tool, enumerates SMB shares, which have like files within them. Sometimes maybe a sysadmin will put like high privileged users' credentials in there, like passwords, usernames. So if you can find that, it's pretty good to have as an adversary. LDAP search, same thing. Even though it's not a malicious tool, it's good to enumerate since you can see what users, organizational units, group policies exist within the Active Directory. And PowerSploit is like a package of PowerShell scripts. A particular script within that is called PowerView, and that'll actually highlight like what vulnerabilities are present in the Active Directory or the workstation that you run it on. And next is lateral movement, which within Active Directory is pretty good for an active or adversary to perform if they want to jump from one location to another. So they'll move across systems within the domain. Doesn't necessarily have to be from one domain to another. It can be from one computer to another or one forest to another. You're just sort of moving from one system to another. This can be done using like pass the hash, where you'll use the hash credentials that you obtain through some sort of method. And rather, the important thing with this is you don't actually need the user's password. You just use their hash that you obtain to either access the service or gain access to another system. And it allows you to impersonate a user essentially without the plain text passwords. You can crack them offline, but there's really no point. You can just use that hash and still access other stuff. Pass the ticket, same thing. It's obtained through Kerberos. You still need to do that Kerberos process that we mentioned earlier, but it'll allow you to access other services as well. And golden ticket, this is like the most I guess dangerous one, is where you'll compromise the KRB TGT. you'll forge like a ticket granting ticket. And from there, you'll essentially have persistence on the machine. If the domain admin changes passwords, you'll still have access. You essentially can't get kicked out. It's like the top thing to get. And just a visualization on lateral movement. So let's say we have domain X compromised, and there's a bidirectional trust from X to Y. And from Y to Z, there's also a bidirectional trust. So the adversary can just sort of move across different forests and domains. And from there, they essentially own the entire forest or the entire, forest and left and right forest as well. So the point of this is you kind of want to question what trust you're establishing. You don't always want to set bidirectional trust. If it should be only one-way trust, then just set a one-way trust. You can unintentionally put vulnerabilities in your forest and domain by setting incorrect trusts. And exploits and post-exploitation. These are just some popular exploits that you'll come across if you try to gain access to Active Directory or target environment that has Active Directory. One is zero logon, where you reset the domain controller's password, giving you essentially ownership of that domain controller. Another one is Eternal Blue. It's pretty interesting if you have time to look into on your own time. I think it was developed by the NSA, and it gives you remote code execution over a system that you exploited using Eternal Blue. And this is done via SMB version 1. So if you see SMB version 1, that's a potential vulnerability in the domain controller. And Petit Patam is you intercept the authentication between domain controller and a client computer. And once the NTLM hash is sent, you intercept that hash and you can use that to authenticate to other computers. And Kerberoasting, it's pretty much Kerberos, where you'll request a ticket granting service ticket and you can access other services within the domain. And post-exploitation, this is a popular part of post-exploitation is credential dumping. You do need system or administrative access for this, so you can't just do this as a normal standard user. And some tools that are used are Mimikatz and secret dumps. LSAS is like dumping credentials from memory, and secret dump is you dump credentials from SAM, which is forgetting what it stands for, but essentially these contain like Kerberos ticket or Kerberos hashes and user hashes as well, NTLM hashes.
Now there are ways to remediate or I guess mitigate the potential vulnerabilities an active domain environment would have. So for pass the hash and golden ticket, it would be pretty good to disable unused services. For instance, maybe you have remote desktop protocol enabled, and that could be like a potential attack surface. So disabling services like that, even if you're not planning on utilizing them, is a good practice. Placing restrictions on user privileges. So a user should not have, I guess, or a domain user must not have local admin access on a workstation, or a domain admin should not be able to connect to a regular workstation so it creates less of an attack surface. And also blocking unnecessary traffic via firewall, or having your domain to be limited to certain IP ranges. Specifically for a golden ticket, it would be good practice to reset the password for the user KRBTGT, because if an attacker has credentials for that account, they could basically create their own ticket and use it to authenticate themselves to certain resources on the domain. Zero logon, make sure your systems are up to date. Microsoft like patched it a while back. And then Eternal Blue, This manipulates the SMB or server message block protocol, specifically version 1. So it'd be best to update it to either version 2 or version 3. And I guess just general practice for an Active Directory environment, have strong password requirements, could have place specific character or a minimum character requirement, as well as a having special characters and numbers required. Enforce frequent password changes for all users within the domain. And you could implement multi-factor authentication. So whenever a attacker obtains user credentials, there's like an extra barrier that basically an obstacle for an attacker whenever they're trying to access a certain environment. Yeah, that was updated. Basically use LDAP-S, which is the more encrypted focus version of LDAP, and prioritize Kerberos authentication. So I'll be showing a demo on how to set up a domain controller, and then as well as join a Windows workstation to the domain controller. So if I could. So right here we have our domain Windows server. So right now we're gonna install the Active Directory domain services first, and as well as the DNS server, because in order to join a domain in order to join a workstation to a domain controller, you need to have DNS essentially set up. So just looking through features, I think SMB1 was checked, and it should not be checked when you are installing Active Directory. And then this whole process usually takes a while, but if I skip ahead. Okay, so Active Directory has been installed, so you would click on that flag with the exclamation point, and then you would create a new forest since you're creating an entirely new domain, and there's no like domain to join off of. And you just place like just a domain name, and of course, make sure you remember your directory services or DSRM password. Just create one, but whenever you log into your once like Active Directory is set up on your domain controller, I believe it would still be your local administrator password. Like, so the same password prior to installing Active Directory. You just leave that as your domain name or without the .local. These are specific file paths, review. And it says everything's installed or everything seems good. And then now it's installing and starting the domain controller service. Okay, then once that's done, it's going to prompt you to restart, which it would automatically do at some point. So you would use your regular or your previous password, local password, to log into like the domain admin account on Active Directory. So as you can see, the domain is created, and we're now on the workstation portion where we're joining it to a domain. So right now I'm changing the DNS server to point to the IP address to the domain controller, so it'll be able to resolve like whenever I'm trying to whenever I'm trying to join the workstation to a domain controller, inputting Swift lakes.local or the domain name would allow it to resolve or allow the workstation to say, oh, this domain name is associated with this IP address, which is the IP address of the domain controller. And it's successfully been joined. And if you looked at Active Directory, we'd see that your recently added workstation. Oh, that's crazy. All right, so Friday's workshop. So from 4 to 6 at building 162 1001, which is over there, the big lecture hall. You'll be working as a sysadmin for a company called Swift Lakes, and you'll be tasked to perform any or configure one Active Directory domain, as well as fix any misconfigurations. Some tasks you'd be doing is, joining a workstation to the domain, which I previously showed. Modifying user privileges, group privileges, and as well as deploying applications via the group policy management. That concludes today's meeting. If you have any questions, feel free to message the Discord. And yeah, thank you.